Hello everyone and welcome to Big Rock Moto. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My 4 months with the 2024 Suzuki V-Strom 800DE are just about to come to an end. And so here's what you can expect in today's episode, the final episode featuring the 800DE. We'll take one final ride on the bike out in the Borrego Desert. Then we'll talk about a summary of the pros and cons of this bike as I see it. And then we're going to do a bit of a deep dive comparison between the other middleweight mid-size adventure bikes in this $10,000 to $12,000 price category. So these are going to be its direct competitors: the Honda Transalp 750, the Yamaha Tenere 700, the Aprilia Tuareg 660, the KTM 790 Adventure, and I think very interestingly, I want to compare it to Suzuki's own V-Strom 650, which they still manufacture.
All right, we're in the Borrego Desert State Park here in Southern California. We've got some cool sandy trails, got cactus everywhere. So let's jump on the V-Strom and have one final kind of send-off off-road ride on the V-Strom. I've got the shorter windshield on here. I've got the bike kind of stripped down more for off-road mode after I got back from the Northern California BDR, so it's a little bit more fun. Oh, you better be willing to take some cactus in the chest. Whoa! Oh, it gets sideways really easily. Ow! The challenge with riding these trails out here is you've got this sandy kind of ridge in the middle. You've got the tire tracks. If I ride in the tire tracks, I'm scraping up against all of the brush and the cactus, so it's pretty challenging. Woo, sideways there. It's actually surprising. You can throw this bike around pretty good. It hides its 510 pounds fairly well, actually. About this before, but really nice stable rake angle on the suspension. Bike is, for an adventure bike in sand, it does pretty well. Whoa! Holy crap. That was a big one. Sand is a challenge on adventure bikes, you know, but it's good practice. Whoa. Woo! Test the suspension out a little bit. Whoa! Woo! Woo! Whoa, that was a big one. Yeah, so we talked about this already. The suspension is really softly sprung. The number one upgrade to do to this bike would be to get the suspension set up with better springs. You know, that would make all the difference. It's such a capable bike. It just needs a little bit better spring rates. I can't remember if we've done the drop and lift on this bike, but I think we have, but let's just do it again. So I've got the Moto Alpine 30 panniers that I'm testing, the new super lightweight ones. They're pretty awesome. Still got the Tusk racks, factory front bars, and skid plate, Cyclops lights, hide now tires. Let's see how well these crash bars work. Let's let it really dig in there. Yeah, crash bars work pretty nice. Luggage taking some of the toll there. Of course, I've got Barkbuster handguards. It's heavy. I mean, it feels 500 pounds for sure. It's maybe a little bit easier to lift than a Tenere 700, but you feel the weight, you know, you feel that 500 pounds for sure. Let's do one little final send-off ride on the street here, and we're really going to send it. Woo! Suspension has a lot of dive, just those soft springs. So when you're trail braking it deep into these corners, you get a lot of front end dive. But that's true of most of the adventure bikes. Come on, go!
All right, let's summarize the pros and cons of the V-Strom 800DE. If you've watched the video series to this point, you're probably familiar with some of these points, but let's summarize here. For me, the engine, it's such a tractable, linear, smooth engine, and the fueling, the throttle response at low speeds or at any speed, it's just so dialed in and so refined. You can chug in second gear at idle speed and the bike will not stall. It does not have any jerkiness. It's just such a great setup in that regard. Moving on to the suspension. I like the fact that it does have some pretty good adjustments, unlike some of its competitors, although as a downside, it is undersprung. However, that's true of most motorcycles. The suspension has really good potential for some tuning. So if you're a more aggressive rider, putting in some stiffer springs would do a huge difference just doing that. If you wanted to mess with the valving, the damping, the shim stacks, you could of course do that as well. But the components are good and I think the potential is there. Next up for me on the Pro, the maintenance on the bike is very easy relative to other bikes. Oil change is easy. The air filter access, importantly for people who are going to ride off-road a lot, is under the seat, not under the fuel tank like the Transalp 750. The bike's comfortable. Ergonomically, it's comfortable. The seat's pretty good. The seating position is pretty good. The wind protection is okay, not great. And except for the engine heat, which we'll talk about on the cons, it's a pretty comfortable bike. The TFT display, the screen itself is big, legible, contrasty, super easy to use. Also, the electronics are useful. The traction control and ABS modes are useful even off-road if you get it in the right setting. And the controls are extremely easy to set in terms of all your settings. Very intuitive and quick and easy. They did a great job with that. Next up for me, the transmission, the shifting is incredibly slick and smooth, and the quick shifter is one of the best that I've used. And another pro, I think, obviously kind of goes without saying, which is also true of the Transalp and the Tenere, the Japanese adventure bikes. The reliability on the V-Strom is incredible. You know, have you ever heard of any V-Strom ever really breaking down or leaving somebody stranded? It just doesn't happen. Okay, so what are the cons? What are the things I didn't like about the V-Strom in the 5 or so months that I've had it? The biggest thing that stands out to me is it was very, very hot on my legs in the summertime. Now that it's gotten into fall and winter, the temperatures are cooler, I still notice the heat there, but it doesn't really bother me because it's cool outside. But when the temperatures were 85 degrees Fahrenheit and above, and I'll put the Celsius below, the engine heat on especially my right leg, but both legs was very, very much a problem. It was extremely annoying and very uncomfortable. Just telling you like it is. We've talked about this as a downside too, but the suspension is really undersprung, that the spring rates are way too soft for any average size rider. But this is true of a lot of bikes, and the Transalp is the same way. Another downside to this bike, and we'll talk about this in a minute in the comparisons, it is on the heavy side. So it's almost 510 pounds. I'll put the kilograms here on the screen. That makes it about 60 pounds heavier than the Transalp or the Tenere. And there are certain situations where you notice that, although I will say it's still easier to lift for some reason than the Tenere 700 when you drop it. Maybe the center of gravity is a little better on this bike, but it does kind of have a bit of a heavier feel depending on what riding situation you're in. Sometimes you feel that extra 60 pounds. Another downside is Suzuki chose not to equip the bike with tubeless rims, and they chose not to equip it with factory cruise control. I think these are some notable downsides for a bike that's going to be used for touring. Now, I think in Suzuki's mindset, they're thinking, okay, well, we have the 1050 DE V-Strom or XT as well, which has, I believe, tubeless and cruise control. But I think what's happening is people prefer to get the mid-size bike. They don't need the 1050. And in most ways, this is a better bike than the 1050, in my opinion. Much lighter, better handling, much better off-road, less expensive. So give us the features on the mid-size bike. I think that's what customers want, and I hope Suzuki and other companies, because we see the same thing with the Transalp and the Tenere, I guess. So I hope that these companies start listening a little bit more to what the customers are wanting in the future. All right, now let's dive into, how are you going to choose which motorcycle to buy? It's a question I get emailed or sent to me almost every single day. So let's talk about how this bike stacks up to its main competitors. I'm going to do it a little bit differently on this video. Some videos I go deep into the specs and we have spreadsheets and we geek out on the numbers. I don't want to do that as much here. I want to give you more like real world practical differences between these bikes. So let's start with Suzuki's own V-Strom 650 XT. This is really interesting, and I've thought a lot about this. And in some ways, I might actually prefer the 650. So let's talk through this. So you have a parallel twin engine on the 800. The outgoing, well, I shouldn't say outgoing. They're still showing the 650 as a 2024, and I don't know about the 2025 model year, but you can still see it on Suzuki's website. You can still buy the 650. Getting away from the 90-degree V-twin, going to the parallel twin. It makes sense from a manufacturing point of view. It's easier to package the rest of the bike, the airbox, the gas tank, everything with a more compact parallel twin engine than it is with a bulky 90-degree twin that takes up more room in the bike. So I get that. And this 800 engine is great, but I think that the V-twin engine, in particular the 90-degree V-twin that they were using, was smoother, sounded better, and although this has more power, I'm not sure that I really like this engine much better than the 650 twin. I actually think I might prefer the 650. The 650 V-Strom is significantly lighter by about 30 to 40 pounds, and that is a significant amount. The 650, if you get the XT, it has tubeless spoke wheels, although you don't get the off-road oriented 21-inch front wheel or the long travel suspension you get on this bike, so there's trade-offs. The 650 has a lower seat height than this 800. Going to the 800, you're getting more power and more torque. This bike has much better suspension with more adjustability and a lot more travel for off-roading. This bike has modern electronics in terms of the ABS and traction control that are useful off-road, better TFT, everything is in the modern era. This bike's easier to maintain than the 650. Getting to stuff is easier. The air filter on the 650 was buried under the gas tank. I used to own one of those bikes. I remember doing the air filter service. It was a real pain. This bike right under the seat. And in price, the 650 V-Strom costs less than the 800. So I guess what I'm saying here, and the 650 V-Strom doesn't have any engine heat. It's one of those kind of grandfathered in bikes that we still have that they didn't have, I guess, like whatever the Euro 5 or Euro 6 thing requirements are, where they have a super hot catalytic converter, and it's just the bike runs so hot nowadays with these new bikes that it just roasts your legs and you feel like you're riding on a nuclear, bomb or an oven. The 650 didn't have that. And that's something I think I liked about the 650. So I guess what I'm saying is consider that as an option to this. All right, now versus the Yamaha Tenere 700. The T7 is really the gold standard of middleweight adventure bikes because it's proven to be unbelievably reliable, great aftermarket modifications, and it's very good off-road. So how would you choose between these bikes? Well, this Suzuki is 60 pounds or 27 kilos heavier, but when you drop it, this is easier to lift. For whatever reason, I think it's the engine being too high and the chassis and the fuel tank being too high on that T7 just makes it very difficult to lift. The Suzuki, this bike is much more comfortable for road riding and long days on the bike than the T7. Better seat, better wind protection, you've got the bigger fuel tank. It's just a better touring bike, whereas the T7 is more towards the off-road side. Except for one thing, which is engine heat. I don't notice any excess engine heat on the T7, maybe a little bit of heat, but this is way worse in that regard. Off-road, the Yamaha is better. It just is. It's firmer suspension, it's narrower, it's smaller, it's lighter. On the highway, the Suzuki's better. Suzuki has a larger fuel tank, significantly more. You get about another gallon, or what is that in liters? I'll put that below. But you get more fuel range out of the Suzuki than the Yamaha for sure. Now we don't get the world rate Teneres. In the USA, we only get the standard Tenere, which is a huge disappointment, but we only get the standard one. This bike, the Suzuki, has more power. The Tenere, however, has longer service intervals. For your valve, your major services, your valve inspection, Tenere, I think, is 26,000 miles, or what is that, like 40,000 kilometers, somewhere in there. And then the V-Strom is less. I think it's 16,000 miles, or like, what is that, 26 or 28,000 kilometers. So less servicing over time if you're going to stack miles if you get the Tenere. Seat heights, the V-Strom was lower to the ground than the T7, and that is important for shorter people. Although I see that Yamaha is now coming out with a lowered version of the T7 for 2025. All right, what about versus the Honda Transalp 750? Now I did a 6-month series, a lot of videos on this bike. It was very popular, very successful on my channel. You can go see those. A lot of you probably already have looked at those videos. The V-Strom is heavier than the Transalp. Again, that's 60 extra pounds. The Transalp, unlike the Tenere 700, the Transalp feels really light. The Transalp, among all the bikes between the V-Strom, the Tenere, and the Transalp has the lightest feel and the sportiest feel. So I really like that about the Honda. The Honda has similar horsepower, but the Suzuki has more like low-end torque and low-end grunt. Maintenance is better on the Suzuki because you've got easier air filter access. The Honda's under the fuel tank. The Suzuki has better ground clearance than the Honda and better suspension with adjustability and more traveled, better for off-road. Although, saying that, the suspension on the Honda, even though it's non-adjustable and it's kind of soft, it's actually not that bad. The highway performance is pretty, they're both really good for touring. They're both comfortable, both have decent wind protection. The engine is smooth on both. The Transalp engine is smoother. The V-Strom has some vibrations in the engine between 5,000 and 6,000 RPM, around that 70 to 80 mile per hour cruising speed, or right in there around that 115 to like 130 kilometer an hour range. The V-Strom has vibrations. The Transalp doesn't. So Transalp's a bit smoother motor, but they're both good highway touring bikes. Off-road, it's a tough call, but I'd say they're almost equal off-road, in fact. The Honda costs less money, and it doesn't have the engine heat issues that this bike does. Honda is more fun, and Honda feels faster because it's got a better power-to-weight ratio because it's so much lighter. So it kind of sounds like I'm saying that Transalp is better. I'm not really saying that. I think as an overall package, this has some really good points to it. But the Transalp is an amazing motorcycle as well, so that's a tough one. Okay, versus the Aprilia Tuareg 660. If you've seen my channel videos before, you know I'm a big fanboy of the Aprilia. I've had one, I did a review series on it. I really do think that in terms of performance, not ownership, not reliability, not those things, but performance-wise, the Transalp blows all these other bikes out of the water entirely. Well, except maybe for the KTM, which we'll get to in a minute. But the Transalp is the best. Overall performance on the Transalp, off-road, on-road, comfort, suspension, chassis. The Aprilia is superior, like, by a big margin. Okay, it just is. Aprilia does have some engine heat as well. You get to things like the ownership, the reliability. That's where you have an issue with the Aprilia. They're not as reliable. The ownership experience is not going to be as good. Less dealer network. It's just a fact. I try to be very objective when I talk about these things and very fair. I'm not saying that Aprilia is unreliable, but let's be real. Is, a Suzuki, a Honda, or a Yamaha more reliable in the long run than an Aprilia or a Ducati or a small Italian bike? Yeah, it is. Like, we all know that, so I'm not going to deny it. The Aprilia comes with tubeless rims and cruise control, which the competitors don't, except for the KTM. The Aprilia costs a little bit more than like this V-Strom, but it's not a huge amount, and I think it's justified for the performance you're getting. We've talked about the dealer network. So, man, the Aprilia is a great choice for somebody who wants the maximum performance, the most fun, amazing off-road, like the best off-road middleweight adventure bike in my opinion. Also really good on the road. You're willing to put up with maybe a little bit more little issues here and there with just owning an Italian bike, They have had some small issues, not major ones, but if you buy a V-Strom or a Transalp or a Tenere 700, you're not going to have issues. Let's just face it. And that's a big deal for a lot of people. What about versus a KTM 790 Adventure? I almost forgot to put this in this in the slides here because it's kind of a newer bike, but I did review this bike. I have a full review, which I'll link somewhere here. The KTM, I think, is 11,000 bucks right now. Man, that is amazing for what you get. You know, the KTM has the most power out of all these bikes I've talked about. Really high performance, very sporty, very fun to ride, good on the road, pretty comfortable. Off-road, it's pretty darn good, although suspension is kind of bouncy, kind of rough, which you can upgrade that. KTM is made in China. You know, this is one of their bikes made by CF Moto in China. KTM has a firmer, sportier suspension setup. It's much more fun to ride. It's much lighter. You've got the saddle style fuel tanks, low center of gravity, extremely durable for crash protection. You don't have to get any crash bars or anything. It comes with handguards. It comes with the skid plate. The fuel tank protects the engine, so none of this, all this extra weight. So it ends up being dramatically lighter. The downside, well, it's KTM. So you have those reliability concerns and ownership concerns that come with a KTM adventure bike, and you don't have that with a Suzuki. All right, well, that's about going to wrap it up for the long-term test of the Suzuki V-Strom 800DE. Huge shout out, huge thank you to Suzuki North America, Suzuki USA for allowing me to have this bike for this length of time and do the Northern California BDR with it, do the modifications, which I've now taken off. Really was grateful for that. And thank you all for watching and tuning into this series. Now, things that I've missed, left out, put them down below in the comments. I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. If you like these kinds of review series and the types of videos I do, you can consider supporting the work I'm doing here, and there's ways to do that in all my videos in the pinned comment and the description below. Beyond that, thank you so much for watching. Ride safe, and I'll see you out there.